Welcome to everybody. My name's Greg Donnelly. I am the bookshop manager at Kirstenbosch, and welcome to today's Wednesday talk, brought to you by Straight Nature, Room to Grow, and Sandby. And today we are very, very lucky and honored to have the renowned historian Roger Stewart, who will be giving us a talk that will be centered around his brand new book called Burchell's African Odyssey, which was released a couple of weeks ago and is a fascinating book studying the journeys of William Burchell. It was co-written by Marion Whitehead, and Roger is a real expert on all things pertaining to Mr. Burchell. He's been studying him for 18 years, and Roger also conducts his self-funded research and publishes African maps and history of the Good Hope and everything to do with mapping and historical facts all around the Cape region. So thank you all for joining us. We will be having a fascinating talk. There will be an question and answer session at the end of the talk. And just remember that you can buy the book directly from the Kirstenbosch website. We have put up a link. I think it will be in one of the slides. If not, you can just go to the book site online shop, and you get 15% discount for a full week after today's talk. So without any more waffle from me, Roger, thank you very much for joining us today and for giving us this opportunity, and everyone enjoy Roger's talk.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today and to discuss what has been my own odyssey for quite a few years. And what I'm going to focus on from this book today is just the return journey, which is chapters 4 to 8. The first few chapters are an introduction, and the last chapter is what happened with Burchell afterwards when he was in London. And so I'm going to, without further ado, introduce you first, for some of you who don't perhaps know much about Burchell, very briefly explain who he was. And a lot of this has been summarized in an article, and you can see all the link to it if you want to go and read it. But he was born in 1781 in Fulham in London. He died in 1863. He went and had he was fortunate to have a private education. His father had a very profitable nursery in Fulham. And after that, after his schooling, he studied botany at Fulham, the family nursery, and also at Kew. And then in 1805, as a result of that, he was awarded a fellowship of the Linnaean Society when he was only 21 years old, or 22. He then proceeded to St. Helena, where he remained for 5 years, then came to South Africa for 5 years, went back to London, and for 10 years was involved mainly in horticulture. He was cultivating plants that he had or bulbs and seeds that he'd collected in South Africa, and then also published his book. In 1825, he went to Brazil for another 5-year-long trek, and after that returned to London. And quite sadly, he went into a decline after returning to London, and became very depressed and isolated, and terminated his own life in 1863 when he was into his 80s. Now, the issue about the travels is that his book, The Travels, ends in August 1812, but he only returned to London in 1815. And that really created a gap for Marion and me to get involved in trying to find out what happened in that 3-year period. So we have Burchell there on the top left, and there's his view of Lion Mountain. Just consider what it looks like today. That was what it was like in 1810 when he arrived. He then spent 6 months preparing for his journey, because he'd arrived never having traveled in a wagon. He'd never slept outside. He'd never been in South Africa. And yet he wanted to travel all the way through to near the border of Botswana. And you can imagine the reception that he got. But interestingly enough, everyone wanted to help him. And he was extraordinarily diligent and took 6 months to prepare. Then his outbound journey lasted 13 months. That was from Cape Town to Litakun. And the reason it didn't take only 8 months of travel, which is what the direct route would have done, was because he decided to take an excursion to explore the Vaal River. And then he also went all the way to Graafrenet because he needed more staff. The staff that he had with him, or the staff that were at Klaarwater, which today is Griquastad, were not keen to travel into the area further north towards Botswana as we know it today. And so he decided to go all the way to Graafrenet in order to hire more staff, which he did. But those 2 excursions took him 4 months. So in essence, he's traveled to Litakun, which is now Dithakong, which is just northeast of Kuruman, took a year, but 8 months of real direct travel. And then the book ends at Litakun. He gives a description of the Botswanan, of the people, known as the Batlaping, or he called them the Bachapin. And his book ends abruptly. And we have absolutely no further information directly of what happened after that. But his return took 32 months. So less than about a year to get to his first destination, and then almost 3 years to get back. And that involved a number of different segments, which I'll be going through in the presentation. And he returned to South Africa, to Cape Town in April 1815, spent about 4 months preparing for his return to London, and arrived back in London in November 1815. So this presentation is going to be about this return journey. And because it is so long, I'm obviously going to have to select events that I think were interesting, and to give some sort of a hint of some of his work that he did on his return journey. And this is a map which shows the biomes of South Africa, and you can see his outward journey has over the Cape Fold Mountains through towards Kuruman. And this is Litakun, which is now Dithakong. And after his book, this is the rest of his journey. He went up to, went further north into the Kalahari, retraced his steps, and then took this long route here, going all the way through to the Great Fish River, going through a number of different biomes, and then essentially followed the coastal plains, but it also went into the coastal mountains on his return journey to Cape Town. Now, Burchell was an extraordinarily busy man, and this slide just gives you some idea of what he was involved in. And you can see that on a daily routine was extraordinarily rigorous. He spent a lot of time. He first of all woke up very early in the morning, prepared for the day's journey. He had to work out what they were going to eat, where they would eat if he knew where they were heading directly. He had to eat and prepare meals. He had to read his distance every few hours while he was traveling. That's what the tachometer was. It measured it from the rotation of the wheels of his wagon. He had to notice the time. He also measured the temperature regularly during the day. He would take compass bearings of prominent features of his route, because this allowed him to eventually develop and draw a map of Southern Africa, which was very accurate. He then recorded meticulously all his key observations, flora, fauna, landscape, the specimens he collected, and he would also draw along the way. And so if we imagine that the records that would have been available, had they not been destroyed or lost, we would have had both text and drawings. Drawings have survived, but with regard to text, we have only one journal, which covers only 1 month of his return. The rest we've had to try and dig up from other sources. He engaged visitors. They had to spend a lot of time negotiating rivers, rocky and sandy terrain. They had to find water regularly for the animals. They had at least two, about almost 3 span of oxen, 20 dogs. There were at least 12 people. Then they would outspan he'd consult with his staff, and then he would preserve his specimens. So this was a day in the life of Burchell on his outbound journey, and we know from the one surviving journal that his return journey was fairly similar. Now, he had quite a few challenges facing him, and I'm now taking him, we're now in Litukun, which is northeast of Kuruman. The local people they had developed a tension between them, mainly because they wanted guns from Burchell, and he was not happy to. He actually refused to. They eventually managed by guile to get one from him, and eventually he decided, I must leave. And it was at that point that his book ends. And what he had to deal with was uncharted territory, other than the parts that he had traveled to previously. But there was no accurate map of Southern Africa that would tell him exactly how to go. The maps that had been developed by the VOC had been taken back to the Netherlands, and the map from people like John Barrow were not accurate or detailed enough to give him the information. And some of the places were genuinely uncharted. They had never been mapped, and he was the first to map them. He had to travel through frontiers which were unsettled. Those were the eastern frontier on the edge of at the Great Fish River, but also to the north of that, where mainly the San had retreated to, where previously he had been told they were extraordinarily hostile, but he was fortunate he was able to befriend them. He had to deal with rugged terrain, climate that at times was unbearably hot, no water, and parts of his map show regularly that he was suffering from, the whole party was suffering from lack of water. They seemed to always find food, although they ate mainly meat, but they did try to find vegetables and certainly some kinds of bulbs and berries on the way. But they were never really hungry. That was not the major issue. It was always water that was the problem. The next problem that he had was that his wagon became overloaded. Burchell collected in all about 63,000 specimens, that's animals and plants, and therefore his wagons, he had a second wagon, he started initially with one, bought a second in Tulbach, became very overloaded, and he really struggled to negotiate the wagon in certain areas, and as I'll explain later, he even had to discard some specimens. Another problem for him was that he started to run out of paper. He had not been sure how long he would be away, and he needed paper for pressing his specimens. He needed paper for drawing, for writing. He wrote a number of letters, and he kept a very detailed manual. And so that became a bit of a problem for him as well. Now, given that there was that his book ends at Litukun, there was no further manuscript ever found, and no journals other than one that covered one month of the journey. How did we manage to investigate his return journey? Well, it just so happens that parts of the travels, his book, covers a couple of small events that occurred on the way back, so we were able to get hold of those. Most important, though, was the map that that accompanied the book, which was quite detailed, and there was also his original sketch maps at Oxford. This OUMNH is Oxford University's Museum of Natural History. There was some information, not much, on his return journey in a pamphlet that he wrote just prior to the 1820 settlers coming, just called Hints on Emigration. We have the one journal. There are manuscript documents at Kew mainly. There are one or two in at Oxford, but there are also his letters, which are at Oxford, and those were extraordinarily useful because he made copies of all his letters, and those we were able to get hold of. And the manuscript documents, although they were mainly on botanical issues, they sometimes had gems of information that gave us information about that gave us some insight into his return journey. Then there were two publications. Burchell was not a prolific writer. He only wrote two scientific papers, one a letter and then the other one a very short description of a bird. But other naturalists have subsequently investigated his collections, and they provided further information on aspects of his journals, but it was really about what he found and what he collected rather than information on what happened during his journeys. I've mentioned the letters, which were really important. And then his drawings. He made over 500 drawings while he was traveling, and over about 350 of those are at Museum Africa. And they were fortunately very well catalogued by a previous director of what was then the Africana Museum. And that gave me and Marion a lot of insight into what he saw. And fortunately, every one of his drawings is dated. So we're able to link drawings to events and times on his journey, both outbound and on the return. And then his specimens also gave us, the labels on those gave us quite a lot of information. So now I'm going to start with his return journey. That's the bit of a background into Burchell. Here is Litakun. Again, I mentioned that's now Dithakong. Here is what became Kuruman. And when he left Litakun at the end of his book, the first month was spent on this little loop here that you can see in green, where he actually went on a safari. Now, I call it this first safari in the Kalahari. What he did, in fact, was to go out to hunt for food. They had found that near Litakun, because of the dense inhabitation there, they were unable to find enough animals or to provide food for the whole party. And so he went on this safari and went all the way towards Kuruman, this final destination being a place he called the garden, because he actually planted a number of vegetables, mainly, and herbs. I'm not sure why, because he then intended to go back to Litakun. Maybe he intended to visit it again at some other stage. And it was during this period that he collected a number of interesting specimens, but is also the period that is covered by the surviving journal. So if you imagine that whole journey, just this part is covered by information in his journal. He then traveled further north and went to a place that he called Chue Spring, which today is Hienungfle in the Kalahari, and ends on a short little journey to the Maji Mountains, then took a circular route back to Kuruman, and Hotazel, if you want to get a feel for where this is geographically today, is around about over here where my pointer is at the moment. Returned to Kuruman, and then took a bit of a break because that was a really tough journey. Now, during his safari, he made a number of collections, and at the same time executed some really beautiful drawings. One of the animals that he found, but the specimen has no longer exists, was the western leopard toad. And I'm very grateful to all the naturalists who've been able to help me with identification of some of these toads. But he mentions in his journal how it was the beginning of the rainy season again, and suddenly, after a very quiet winter, he started to hear the toads again. And I think anyone who lives in where I am, we hear the western leopard toad. You get the guttural toad in Gauteng and elsewhere, and we hear all of those at about that time. So he was greeted by this orchestra of toads. He started actively to collect bulbs during this safari. And amongst the first that he collected was the hypoxis, which he later cultivated in Fulham. So this semi-desert, what he collected here in the semi-desert, he cultivated, and he got it to flower in 1816, was the first year of his return. And this is his drawing of that cultivated plant. And he also, very close to Litakun, had a wonderful sighting of the saddlebill, which he also colored. While he was at the garden, despite the fact that there had been some hostilities, or it wasn't hostilities, there was tension with the Bashapin, that's the Patlaping people at Litakun, he was visited by numerous locals. There's a tremendous cattle trade going on in that area. And he mentions here, for example, on one night, the two Bashapins remained with us the last night, and one a herdsman, a poor man in the Nokwe, of whom I made a portrait. And here is a portrait, and the original of this portrait is actually in South Africa with one of the descendants of his brother. And here is another portrait of the other visitor. And here are some of the ethnographic parts of his ethnographic collection. There's a milk bag here at the bottom, and then two pair of sandals, and those are also at Oxford University. And he collected about 300 different artifacts, which have been which are really interesting to go and see. And unfortunately, the illustrations are not available on the internet. And here we see him sitting with a local warming his hands, his visitor warming his feet, and this was at the garden. He then returned to Litakun for another 2 to 3 weeks to complete his studies. And when one reads the Burchell's book, and one reads the last 2 chapters on the people that he visited there, it comprises information from his outward bound journey and a little bit from his homeward journey. But he then headed further north, as I showed in the earlier map, and he explains how surprised he was that on these plains that had been untrodden by European foot and uninhabitable to man from want of water, journeys that extended for a long period of time, that he found this Mahonia grandiflora, now Hermania burchelli, which by its profusion and continued succession of scented flowers of the finest scarlet will not fail to arrest the attention of any traveler. Now, this quotation comes from the Botanical Register when this plant was presented. And fortunately for some of these, Burchell provided text which we've been able to find and give us some indication of his return journey. So these would almost certainly have been included in volumes that covered the return. And a major event for him was his first sighting of live giraffes. The first one that he had seen was a stuffed giraffe, and this is a wonderful painting that is at the Brenthurst Museum of a giraffe that had been stuffed by the local Kora and Khoi inhabitants of Klaarwater, that's Griquastad, which was a mission station, and that was his first sighting, but it was unfortunately a dead one. And this is his sighting. It was a very quick field sketch that he obviously did while observing the giraffe out in the Kalahari, but he collected some skins, and these were later stuffed and displayed on the staircase of the British Museum in 1845. And they remained there for quite a considerable time. After reaching Heuningvlei, he took a brief excursion into the Margie Mountains to the north. These are asbestos-laden mountains. And this is just one of the really wonderful scenes that he drew. A very peaceful scene with a small herd of elephant. You can see some of his staff. As always, usually they're accompanied by dogs, and as he usually does, he puts himself with his back to the viewer. And it was while he was on this excursion that he collected Burchell's yellow, or Calotus, he was then called Pterocolus subfasciatus, a very beautiful yellow insect. He collected over 1,000 insects, and nearly all of these were collected on his return journey. There is a catalogue of those insects, but to date, no one has investigated or written them up. And since while I was preparing for the book, I asked for pictures of some of the specimens, and I was quite sad to know that quite a few of them seem to be missing, but no one has done a full audit of them to the best of my knowledge. Now, possibly one of the most important events or dramatic events was at Chue Spring, that is Heuningvlei, in October 1812, where he arrived to find a rhinoceros that had been killed by his staff and it was usually, they didn't kill them for him to collect trophies, they collected for food. And you can see here, there are more than 10 people. These are all the locals who crowded around the dead animal And this is the specimen, this painting of this dead rhinoceros is, the original painting is with a family member, a descendant of his brother in the Eastern Cape. But this is an aquatinta which is in the Library of Parliament. Now, it has been said, it has been written that this was the rhinoceros that he saw in the Karoo. Well, this is clearly not the case, because when he was in the Karoo, he was on horseback. He didn't have wagons. Here he's got 2 wagons, and these are asbestos-laden hills, which you do not get in that part of the Karoo. And I'm very fortunate that some local naturalists had a good look at this rhinoceros and declared that it was actually a white rhino and not a black rhino. And that is the rhino for which Burchell is famous. He named it Rhinoceros simus, and that was the simus relates to the flattened form of its nose and mouth. And he wrote here in his unpublished journal about rhinoceroses, saying, inhabiting vast plains which are arid during most of the year, but every day frequenting the springs, not only to drink, but to roll in the mud, which adhering to the hairless skin forms a protection against the scorching heat of the sun. After finding after shooting the rhino, the locals had a wonderful party, but his own staff refused to advance further than Chewish Spring. Burchell was keen to go as far as Luanda, and I think he's fortunate that his staff revolted, because otherwise he'd probably have perished. But so he returned then. He then decided to return. And it was during this return that, on the way towards Kuruman, that he came across Burchell's shrike, or the crimson-breasted shrike. And this was one of the 2 articles this is from an article that he wrote. And this particular picture was the first from the book of first chromolithographs used in zoological illustrations. And I was fortunate to be able to collect this, and I've got it, and it hangs in, not in this study, but it hangs in a hallway. And it was chromolithographed by William Swainson. When he returned to Kuruman, it wasn't Kuruman as a town then, it was just at the Eye, where there were a few locals living. He went fishing, and he caught this tilapia, which later was named Tilapia sparmanii by Andrew Smith, named after Anders Sparman. Smith visited London. I have no record being able to find out if he ever met with Burchell, but he certainly presumably not seen this drawing. Otherwise, I'm sure he would have named it after Burchell. When he was at Kuruman, Burchell made this wonderful self-portrait, which we have cleaned from a very scratched and dirty glass slide put together by Helen Mackay in the 1930s, who did a lot of work on Burchell. So that was the end of the Chue Loop, and that's the area that we know, the part of the trip we know the most of. He then proceeded to the Eastern Cape and came across the very beautiful, what he called Amaryllis, now Amacarus coronica. And coronica is that epithet is named after the Korana people. And here we have what it looks like today in the wild. Here it was in the Botanical Register, where his cultivated plant was published. And here is his own drawings. And he just mentions here that he discovered this beautiful plant in the Korana country. It grew in profusion, and the air was perfumed with the odor of the blossoms resembling those of tuberose, which is meant to be one of the most seductive perfumes. Surprised this hasn't been developed yet as a perfume. And he mentions here how they were now growing in his garden. And he mentions too that in their own environment, they produce their bloom in December, but they had adapted to bloom in the northern summer. The next most interesting part of his return journey is a picture which also has been misassigned to one of an earlier crossings of the Harib River, that's the Orange River. but we can see here the wagon wheels, and that means that he clearly had his wagon with him. What had happened was that the river was full, couldn't cross at the normal drifts, and so he worked closely with the local Kora people who he had befriended on his other journeys, and they helped him develop rafts. So they disassembled the wagon, unpacked it completely, and then took 4 days to ship everything across the river. And he did that quite successfully. And we also know this was done on his return journey, because here we see specimens that he could only have obtained on his return. And we know that these rather heavy specimens you can see at the bottom, he had to discard because his wagon was so overladen. He then proceeded to follow the Orange River, the southern tributary of the Orange River, and eventually got to the Sekoe River, which near a beacon that had been established, which was the most northeasterly beacon of the Cape Colony. And here we see this beacon, it's his drawing, which you can see has been damaged. And this was damaged by the local inhabitants as a signal of resistance to the intrusion into this area by colonists. And the last 4 pieces, these are them over here, have been retrieved, and they are in the Iziko Museum. Unfortunately, at the moment, they are in storage, but they were considered important enough to be taken to the British Museum, where they were displayed. And here is his drawing as well of the beacon as he saw it in more detail. But what is more interesting from a perspective of his art is Burchell's incredible accuracy and his ability of drawing perspective very well. So in this drawing here, we see the eastward view, the tiny little area here, which is the Toverkop, which is the Colesberg. And here is what was known as Chinaman's Hat. And it was near in this area here where there were a lot of game. And I was fortunate enough to be able to take a photograph from this position. We actually had to work out where this beacon had been, take a photograph, and you can see how accurate this panorama is of this very important area. And that beacon or beacon site was meant to be a national monument, but for all sorts of administrative reasons, it never became one. And it's now in the middle of a farm that has become a nature reserve. He then proceeded from the Sekoe River, which was near Colesberg, to Albany. And it was here that there was both disaster and serendipity. He started off in, he got from, you can see here, Komadacha all the way through to Grahamstown. Here's Grahamstown, went through to the Great Fish River mouth, and then proceeded this way to the Kawi River. And then you'll see I've put an arrow here, and what happened was that he had to return, and I'll come back to this just now. He was going to go back to Grahamstown. He stopped off here with people he'd met, and then crossed the river further up. And the reason is quite easy to understand. This is a not very good view of the Kawi River, drawn in 1827. It's not a very good perspective. But what it does show us is, first of all, the steep sides of the Kawi River, and I recently was back there to have a look at it, and it's quite amazing to think that someone not only got their wagons across the river, but were able to ascend those hills. And it was during this crossing that Burchell's one of the overladen wagons got stuck in the mud. We're not sure how, but they managed to extricate it. They got it out, but they got it out on the eastern bank, but he wanted to be on the western bank. So he had to decide what he was going to do, and he decided to go back to Grahamstown. Fortunately, during that episode, some of his collection got wet, but nothing was severely damaged. So he proceeded further north, back towards the Blowkrans. There was a military post there, and he stopped off at a place that he called Date Tree Station. And here we can see the date tree, which he drew in one of his manuscripts. And Marion and I recruited some locals to go and find out, to try and detect where this was. I'd done some work on maps and had a fairly good idea where Date Tree Station was. And we had an excursion one day, and it was really wonderful to arrive and see these same date trees in the same place next to a river. And sure enough, near the date tree, we found the Clivia nobilis, which Burchell was the first to discover. But he was unsure what it was. He wasn't sure if it was an agapanthus. He then thought it was a Certanthus and named it provisionally Certanthus sylvatica. The sylvatica leading us to understand that it was usually found in these, in the thicket, in the shade, in the forested area. Unfortunately, he was abroad when this plant was named, and he was excluded entirely from the naming. But that is a story all in itself. But that was a serendipitous discovery. However, when he got to Blowkrans, he had met with the local commander-in-chief, who suggested to him that he not go all the way back to Grahamstown, but he take a shortcut across the Kauri River higher up. It's about 20 to 30, it's nearly 30 kilometers upstream from the usual crossing. And during the night, and he was given a military escort of three soldiers. But during the night, 23 of his cattle were stolen. Now, 23 cattle essentially is 2 spans, which means he was left with insufficient cattle. He was absolutely furious. He was furious with his staff. He was furious with the soldiers. And because no one had woken him up during the night, they'd heard a rustling but done nothing. And he was now really not up a creek without a paddle, but he was up a creek with a wagon and no oxen. And so he rushed off a very hastily wrote a letter to the military commander nearby on the other side of the Kauri, sent some staff there. Presumably, he only had 2 left with him at that stage, because he sent others to go and search for the cattle, and he enlisted help from them. And we have to assume that they did send staff to him, send oxen to him, because the next day he was at Lombard's post, which was across the Kauri. Now, the overladen wagons were really a problem. He had a shortage of cattle, number one. Number two, he had very heavy wagons. And he stopped off at Uitenhage, which was then the capital of the Eastern Cape, and discovered that there was a ship called the Morley in anchor in Algoa Bay. And so what he promptly did was he took his wagons to the Barkens River mouth, loaded them with most of his collection, nearly all of his collection, into rowing boats, which were then rowed across through the surf and loaded up onto the Morley, which was going to Table Bay. And he just wrote a very cryptic message saying to Rankin and Scott, Strand Street. And with that address, this precious cargo arrived in the Cape fairly shortly afterwards and remained there in safety for 18 months. Now, from Algoa Bay, he then decided to go, and he wanted to go and visit Mossel Bay, and he wanted to visit the Garden Route. But to do that using the usual track, he'd go along the Langkloof, then have to negotiate terrible passes, get to George, and then go all the way back to get to the Garden Route. So he decided, on the advice of the family, probably here at Avontuur, the Zondag family, who hosted many travelers, and he took a rough path and took his wagons down that all the way through to Plettenberg Bay, and then traveled along the coast to George, and then to Mossel Bay. And he had to negotiate. Any of you who've done Prince Alfred Pass will know that the mountains there are quite daunting. And here is a picture by Reverend Latrobe in 1816 of one of the passes they had to negotiate. And you can see there are at least 24 oxen taking one wagon up the hill. Now, Burchell came from the other side, and here is Marion in a 4x4 negotiating the Paardekorp today. And in fact, it is possible for 4x4 enthusiasts to follow Burchell's route in this area, going down past the Kirstenbosch River from the Langkloof all the way through to Plettenberg Bay, which he reached. And when he reached the Plettenberg Bay, collecting along the way, here are two examples, a specimen that was in Botanical Register. Here is the original at Kew. And he camped at the site of the original site of the Van Plettenberg's beacon that was established here, and also drew, this is now, it's actually a small drawing, but when you blow it up, it's amazing how accurate this drawing is of the panorama from Plettenberg Bay, where he remained for a few days, recovering, collecting as usual, and then proceeded to Knysna. And in Knysna, it seems likely and almost certain that he stopped at Melkote Kraal, which was George Rex's house, which had been rebuilt after it had been razed during earlier wars with, and they were completely destroyed. And here is his panorama of the site. And he stayed at Melkote Kraal for over a month. And during that time, he explored a number of areas. And this is a recently obtained drawing of a fish that I had not been aware of until after we published the book, that he had collected in the lagoon. It was the common eagle ray, but he collected a number of other animals as well. And he also took a long walk all the way through to the Knysna Heads. Now, this is a somewhat photoshopped version of a very faded picture, which is in the hands of a descendant of William Burchell's brother in Johannesburg. And they were uncertain what it was when they saw it, but on close inspection, because I'd been to the site, I was able to identify where it is. And these are the Knysna Heads. And here he is, as usual, with his back, if you'd like, back to the camera, back to the scene. He then proceeded towards George and had to negotiate the Kaiman's Hut. This is the descent as it was then. Today, the descent would have been to the right of this over here. Here we see a wagon crossing coming towards the west, which Burchell would have done. And this was a horrific pass. And here you can read for yourselves that this was a terrifying pass. And it was not only the descent. And next time, if any of you ever drive that way and you're going past the fixed camera that seems to trap most of us, just look up to the left and imagine a wagon, fully laden wagon, coming down that hill. And you can see it wasn't just the sides of the gorge, but what also was a problem were the huge boulders along here. And you can still see them today, which threatened to shake the wagon to pieces. Again, this is a drawing by Latrobe 1 year after Burchell was there. Then stopped off in George, and here is a drawing by Burchell, which he shows his wagons, and here is the George Peak. And it had been rumored that he'd lost one of his wagons, but he clearly still had wagons then. And he used this as his base for another month while he explored the forests. And he just says, little is known of the forests, for fatigue and the time required to explore their contents are very great. They've occupied me these last 6 months, but now I must take my leave. Unfortunately, Burchell never got to write about the forests. And I think that is further work on his specimens that he collected in the forests would be of great interest to everyone. And while he was there, he, as usual, hiked. He loved hiking out in the mountains. He went up this route over here, stayed overnight, went right to the top of the George Peak, and then descended. And it was during his descent that he found his third specimen of the plant that eventually had the genus named after him, Burchellia bubelina. And here's the original specimen at Kew. And from George, he then traveled to Mossel Bay, and he went past the Hartenbos homestead, which was home to another one of the generous hosts of many travelers. And we can see the aloes in the foreground. Now, this was not drawn by Burchell, but only a couple of years later by Jehiel Brenton. And I have to believe that this is a reasonably accurate depiction of what it was then. They then went down towards Hartenbos Beach, and most of the road until they got to Santos Beach was in fact on the beach and it wasn't in the hills, which were too difficult to negotiate. And when Burchell came to Mossel Bay, he drew this picture from what today is Santos Beach. And here we see the old warehouse. And here are a couple of the few houses that existed. And he was the first to draw a picture of this grain warehouse that had just got a pitched roof because the flat roof leaked. And here he has taken a drawing looking from behind the warehouse. Here it is, looking across the bay. Now, these images have not been shown before in public, and I was fortunate enough to find them at the National Library of South Africa. I received a hint that there might be a book there and found a book of drawings, and they were fantastic because they were a part of they depicted what he saw on a part of the journey that was really not, that we knew very, very little about. While he was there, he explained that he was in great, to J.C. van der Berg, the secretary at Uitenhage, he wrote to him and said, "I'm in great distress for want of cattle." And he'd heard from Berg that the stolen cattle had been found. So Burchell just promptly said, "Please have 2 men drive them to Swellendam, where they would meet him." And we don't know if they actually did meet. There's no record of that, unfortunately. He then traveled from Mossel Bay westwards along the main road, as it was then. It was quite well established. And I also at the National Library came across this crossing over here, and it was said, "Is this the Droë Rivier?" Now, fortunately, I had been tracking Burchell, and I was able to recognize straight away that this is Hell's Drift at the Gourits River, and you can get virtually identical scene from the base of the Du Plessis Pass. So we have a drawing. We know for certain now where he did cross. And after crossing that river, he then went to along the Allow Road to Riversdale, in which he then ascended the mountains. And the key thing here is that this is where he differs from all the other travelers. He ascended mountains and spent a lot of time in Genadendal, Swellendam, and Kamseberg, collecting a number of specimens, which are very rare today. And I mentioned 2 of them there, the leucodendron and the erica, that are very seldom seen today. But he also collected snakes. It was that time of the year when the snakes were active again. And he actually described the snake. I'm not going to go through this description. Here are his notes, which were in a botanical book of all places, in which he describes the snake in great detail. And here is a skin of one that he collected at a place called Pafadder Station, which was very close to today's Orania. And so he collected in 1811 and in 1814. He described it in some detail in 1822, but it had taken him so long to write. By that time, Blasius Merriam had described the snake in 1820. And so unfortunately, Vipera inflata is now not Bitus inflata, which I thought was a lovely name for the Pafadder, but it now carries the name of someone who published before Burchell. Burchell then proceeded, taking a somewhat novel route, which I don't have time to go into detail, to the Hottentot Kloof, which is also the Ganto Pass. And here we see the oxen and the wagon descending. And over here, the Table Mountain and Lion Mountain in the distance. And he proceeded from here to Stellenbosch. And I'm not sure why, but it is possible, or likely in fact, that one of his friends from Cape Town, with whom he'd been in communication, had come to visit him at the Steenbras River. And that individual, Peter Pullman, had a friend in Stellenbosch, which Burchell had visited before, but they decided to visit it again. And it was en route to there that they discovered the Burchell, the protein named after Burchell. And at Stellenbosch, again, here are pictures from the collection at the National Library of South Africa of a pedestrian bridge. And this is the Drosti right next to it. And here is a farm, and the bridge was between the two. And here, this is Dorp Street in 1815 when Burchell arrived. And on his way back, he stopped at the Blotleray Hills, had a wonderful view of Cape Town, but decided to do a drawing of the interior of his wagon, which he painted in 1820, just before he wrote his book. And here we can see the 50 volumes of books that he took with him, which was his reference library. Here is where he slept. In here is the sextant that he used for determining latitude. Here is the press that he used for his plants, and in fact, he even pressed snakes in there as well. Here is the flute that he played. He was the first to hold soirees between Cape Town and Kalahari. And here are some specimens that he collected. This wonderful painting is at, and it's a relatively small painting, is at the Oxford University Museum of Natural History. And so we come to the end of Burchell's return journey. He stayed back in Cape Town for 6 months, 4 months really, cleaning up, clearing up, doing everything he needed to do to prepare. The cost in modern terms of his return journey was over 250,000 Rand for the ticket and for his 63,000 specimens. Here he is with some with ptosis of his eyes, probably from looking into the sun for 5 years. And here is the sole memorial to Burchell, and that is in the Garden Route Botanical Gardens, which we unveiled in 2014. And it was due to the enthusiasm of people in the Garden Route that this was that someone created the bust for us, and it is really the sole memorial. And here we've got the picture of his Sylvan station, which is included in the bust. And that is the story that is encapsulated in chapters 4 to 9 of the 4 to 8 of our book. And here's a website that we have developed that provides further information. I just want to thank my co-authors, the Straight Nature editors and designers, and the numerous naturalists who helped us identifying specimens and plants and explaining to us what we had sometimes found. Curators of museums are the most underestimatedly valuable people in this kind of research. They have been universally extraordinarily helpful. And a number of friends helped Marion and me as well. And certainly for me, my family had to tolerate many hours of preoccupation with this book. So thank you very much for listening to this story.
Roger, thank you so much. Fascinating as ever. Great to hear it again. We have got some questions in the question and answer session here that I will just relay to you, and if you can just possibly answer for us, please. From Suzanne, we have the question saying, did Burchell meet Le Valiant or go, I think that's how you pronounce it, correct me if I'm wrong, or go on common excursions together?
No, Le Valiant was there in the 1780s, so he was there a lot earlier. The traveler that he did meet while he was on his trek was Reverend John Campbell, who he met in Craafrenet. And Burchell was a little upset later because he found that a picture that he'd given to the missionaries in Klaarwater had given it to Campbell, who then published it in his book, not giving any acknowledgement of Burchell. But that's the only other traveler, famous traveler that we know of that he met.
Okay, thank you. And from Mike Bruton, we've got, what role did Burchell play in recommending the immigration to South Africa of the 1820 settlers? Because other than the various mammals and birds that were named after him, is there any possibility that his lost journals may be found in the archive of a museum or botanical garden somewhere?
Okay, well, I think that just do the last part first. There's been a frantic search for over 200 years for the missing documents, and they've never been found. The ones that have been preserved were bequeathed by his sister Anna, who was apparently rather an odd person, who was she was known to edit some of his earlier journals, like of the journal from St. Helena, and we're not sure what happened, whether they were burned, whether they were handed to some other member of the family, but no one in the Burchell family that I've contacted here has any knowledge of them at all. With regard to the 1820 settlers, there was a merchant, the surname of Norse, whose first name I can't remember right now, who had a real interest in the notion that settlers might be sent to the Cape. And he negotiated for Burchell to answer questions from a select committee which was investigating the possibility of sending immigrants to South Africa. And Burchell was somewhat of a reluctant witness. He went there, he answered all their questions, and at the end of it put out a short booklet, 24 pages, which he wrote, in which he essentially recommended that the first site would be Lower Albany, but that the second alternative site could be near the either higher up or near Somerset East, and the third option was the area around Colesberg. So those were his recommendations. However, he was also very clear that any immigrants who were sent would need to receive tremendous amount of support from the government and from the local government, because they were going to suffer, because they were going to go into a harsh environment that was new to them. They would need support, they would need additional skills, and nearly all of that was ignored, which is not uncommon in politics, I guess. But so he played a significant role. His booklet went into a second edition, and I think from what I understand, was quite widely used. And that really was his role as a witness to support the immigration, but under conditions that were not met.
Thanks, Roger. And Kate asks, did you find out much about his loyal staff?
Yes, in our book we spent quite a bit describing his staff, what they did, the terms and conditions. What was very interesting is that they were not slaves, they were employees. He entered into a contract with them. They had to go to the magistrate. They signed it in triplicate. One copy stayed with the magistrate, one with the employee, another one with him. And we found out not a huge amount, but only as much as Burchell described. And then there was a little bit in his letters as well. But only one of them returned to Cape Town or went back to Cape Town with him. Many stayed at Klaarwater, which was their home, some of them. Others stayed at Graafrenet, where he'd employed them, because that was their home. But he exchanged others as well when he found that the additional staff that he'd recruited were not as good as his original staff, and he needed to replace them. But he generally looked after his staff extraordinarily well. He clothed them, he gave them bedding, he paid them in advance. And with Julie, the one who returned to Cape Town with him, he even gave him a pension for a number of years while he undertook a small venture that turned out not to be a very profitable one.
Great. And I've got a question here which I found in the chat section from Fleur saying, did Burchell ever marry, and what was his brother's name? Okay.
The brother who stayed in South Africa was James Edward Llewellyn Burchell. He arrived in 1821, settled initially in Albany, went to what then was becoming Port Elizabeth, and his son very cleverly married a wealthy woman, and whose father was wealthy, should I say, and they were very successful. And there are a number of Burchells now in the Eastern Cape and elsewhere in the country who descended from James, and they're the ones who have some of the paintings, and they're also the family, and that's a long story in its own right, who donated the pictures to the drawings to the Museum Africa, which was Wits actually initially, and also donated to Oxford University. Sorry, what was the first part of the question? I've missed that.
It was just, did Burchell ever marry?
Yeah, okay. No, he didn't. He was jilted when he was on St. Helena. His fiancée was traveling out on ship to meet him, to get married, fell in love with the ship's captain, dumped Burchell for the captain. We don't know if it was good or bad for either or both. But anyway, that's what happened. and he never married again. He was very much involved with his own. He remained a bachelor, and yeah, he never married. The other aspect of his family was quite interesting, but I don't think we have time for that.
Yeah, I've got one last question here from Jennifer saying, is Spielmannskraal in the Langkloof named for his servant Spielman?
No, it was Spielmannskraal before Burchell arrived. But there are plants and there's a station of his that are named after other staff, but it's not named after Spielman, his employee.
Great, thank you so much, Roger. That was an awesome talk and terribly interesting. So thank you to everyone who joined us. Just remember that you can get the book. All attendees can get the book at a 15% discount from the Kirstenbosch bookshop for the next week. So please come and visit us, or you can just buy it from our online shop. There is a link in the chat section that you can just click on, and it will take you directly to the book. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us. Roger, fantastic talk. Thank you for hosting it for us and giving us a really interesting morning's insight into the travels of William Burchell.
Thank you very much.